Moving on then into Gebser Volume 2. Volume 2 is called Manifestations of the Aperspectival World, an Attempt at the Concretion of the Spiritual. And so now we're moving into a kind of archaeology of all the different aspects of the aperspectival integral consciousness structure. We've already looked at, in the previous volume, the foundations of the aperspectival world. Now we're going to look at the aperspectival consciousness structure in and of itself. He has a little note here in the opening sort of preface called the interim word, where he says that he wants you to make sure that modernism is not to be identified with the new structure of consciousness. And what I said in the last discussion was that I suspect that really one of the limitations of Gebser's idea, and I'll figure this out more as we go along. This is my third reading of Gebser, so I'm going on what my previous reflections were, is that he is indeed, despite what he says here, he is indeed describing modernism and creating a metaphor to unify it and hold it together and to see it as a single zeitgeist, a single development, which I have doubts about having any validity beyond the epoch of modernism itself, because after all, I'm a little bit suspicious of the integral aperspectival consciousness structure, I have to say, because it is a Eurocentric idea. Unlike the other consciousness structures, if we look at them, the magical and the mythical and the mental, they are cross-cultural, or at least the magical and the mythical are cross-cultural. The mental also, though, is cross-cultural because it includes the Magian Judeo-Christian Islamic civilization as well as the Greeks from about 500 BC on. These structures apply across these other generations in a way that the integral does not. The integral aperspectival is a creation of Euro-modern elitism. It comes out of the modernist arts, beginning in painting with Impressionism, in physics with Einstein, in psychology with Jung and Freud, in architecture with the Bauhaus. This is all modernist stuff, and I'm skeptical and suspicious about it because it is, after all, very Eurocentric in that sense, and I'm not sure that I see it applying across the spectrum to other societies, especially in today's world, in which we're living in an age of the rise of the rest, and the West now has to compete on an economic stage in which the rest are showing themselves forth in a way with a strength that they were not able to in the colonial era of what Zygmunt Bauman called heavy modernity. Now we're in liquid modernity. Heavy modernity was in an epoch, as he defines it, of nationalisms, big machinery, and colonialism. Liquid modernity melts all the structures down. And I think Bauman's metaphor actually is going to turn out to be the better metaphor for after the World War II, that is, than Gebser's integral, because what is really happening is a complete liquidation and meltdown of all the structures, all the norms, all the economic norms. Like Zygmunt Bauman says in his books, the individual today can no longer rely on his job. The pension isn't going to be there. His skills will probably become obsolete much quicker than they would have if he had been working in the Fordist epoch, working at Henry Ford's factory, where Ford doubled the wages of his workers so as to guarantee that they would be there for their entire lives. Those days are over with, and Bauman clearly sees that, not just in the economic world, but in the realm of truths with postmodernity. What was considered true yesterday is probably not going to be considered true tomorrow. That's one of the main axioms of postmodernity, and so on. And so I think that in liquid modernity, we have a kind of a better metaphor than Gebser's sphere, is a kind of molten lava of melting forms that were all existing on little islands floating about, each trying to do the best that he can under siege by this constant onslaught of the need to change and catch up and keep up with the latest gadgets and updating our Facebook pages, making sure we have the latest Google gadget, and so forth and so on. So I'm not sure that Gebser's integral aperspectival consciousness structure really is a valid structure in the way I think that the previous structures were. And I think some of his critics say that, there are critics who deny the existence of these consciousness structures. They don't even exist. But I think that to say whether they exist or not is already somewhat to miss the point, because whether they are mere metaphors or not, the fact of the matter is that once you look back over history, you can indeed see changes in the way that humans have regarded themselves in the world in a way that is consistent. Magical man is found wherever we find primitive, tribal, indigenous, aboriginal man, in which magic, and invariably there is no pure form of magic, it's always entangled with some kind of mythology, exists, and it's a structure of consciousness that seems to be very consistent and coherent, and it survives today in latter deficient form in spell casting and Wicca and the witch cults and things like that. We see it pictured in our movies, like the Blair Witch films and all kinds of horror films. It definitely has a distinct structure to it. There's no question about it. That makes it very distinct from the epoch of thought, whether you call it a structure of consciousness or not, that comes in with the Bronze Age, 3500 BC, in which we move into a mythical world in which myth rather than magic, magic is still there but it takes a back seat. Myth steps forward and the organization of the state, organized as a kind of mirror of mythical heavenly processes, becomes the new reality. Mathematics comes in, writing comes in, astronomy comes in, and you do indeed have a complexification of consciousness now that isn't just the primitive man living in nature. Now we're in the containers and the mandalic containers and spheres a la Sloterdijk that have bounded high civilization since 3500 BC. That's a different structure of thinking, and I think that Gebser's distinction between the two is quite applicable, as is also the mental consciousness structure, which, beginning with the Greeks, figures space first with the Greeks as Euclidean, and then later from the Renaissance on as perspectival, as fundamentally rational, and the elucidation and invention of the laws of logic, starting with Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, is something new. And the principle, of non-contradiction, that the syllogistic pyramidal thinking that begins to come in there, and the kind of rise of rationalistic thinking that not only denies the validity of the earlier consciousness structures, but denies that they ever even existed, I think is a very consistent mentality itself. Those are three different mentalities. I don't care whether you call them structures of consciousness or generations of civilization, as Toynbee does, or distinct civilizations as cultures, as Spengler does. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the metaphor acts as a kind of tool that enables us to see and organize history in a way that makes it comprehensible, mnemonically memorable. You can't memorize history. This is another point. History won't stick in your mind if it isn't organized by patterns. Otherwise, it just appears as a mere chaos, as it does to a lot of academics, as a matter of fact, a chaos of mere names and dates, because they don't have these organizing imagistic models that make sense out of it. But with the integral consciousness structure, even though we're going to spend the entire second volume analyzing it, I'm a bit skeptical about it. I think what's happening is, once again, Gebser's response to Spengler's accusations that Western civilization fell apart as it moved into modernism, that modernism is not worth spending one's time on. I think Gebser is responding to that challenge with the creation of an integral consciousness structure that it makes sense out of modernism, confers a single metaphor on it, but I think that once you get out of, let's say, the 1950s, I think it starts itself to melt down and disintegrate into something else that is not covered by Gebser's model. I don't see the average person using his electronic gadgets today living in Gebser's integral sphere. I just don't see it there. I think it's a form of Euro-elitism of the kind of consciousness, that appreciates and values European highbrow cinema, let's say, over against American Hollywood trash. And so we have to keep in mind here, too, that Gebser's references to pop culture are very disparaging all the way throughout, whether he's talking about radio, television, movies. He doesn't like any of it. So that should alarm us to Euro-elitism here. There's a Euro-elitism going on here that wants to salvage high modernism and leave it at that, to kind of build a sphere around it. So that's my initial skepticism and criticism going in here to Gebser's second volume. And the first chapter of the second volume is called The Irruption of Time. And the first section is The Awakening Consciousness of Freedom from Time. And he says here that what is characteristic of the integral consciousness structure is this fascination with time. Time begins to come into the European world picture in a significant way now that hadn't been the case before. He says that time begins to first appear in physics with Einstein, but I wonder here why he doesn't date it from the introduction of the second law of thermodynamics in the middle of the 19th century, as articulated by Ludwig Boltzmann and others, in which we have time's arrow introduced into physics for the first time. Newtonian physics, we recall, had been of processes of moving bodies in space that could be mapped with the infinitesimal calculus, and which didn't really take account of time because any of the processes of these billiard ball planets moving over the pool table were theoretically reversible. Not so once you bring in the entropy principle, which is best pictured, of course, as the old model of two boxes. In one box you have hot particles that are moving very fast and they're agitated. In the other box you have cold particles that are moving very slowly. If you connect the two boxes together and you open up a chamber in between them, gradually the hot particles will move together with the cold particles and they'll slowly randomize and slow down, and they'll all move at the same pace and will achieve something that's called a state of thermodynamic equilibrium. And you cannot, according to James Clerk Maxwell, with his idea of Maxwell's demon, you cannot reactivate the system without inputting fresh energy into it. So time's arrow there is irreversible, and of course Maxwell invented his idea of a demon that sits at the center of the box, a little mythical demon that separates out the fast-moving particles from the slow-moving ones again, and would thereby be able to theoretically reverse entropy by separating these two back into their two separate component boxes. That tension between hot and cold is, of course, what drives all of our automobile engines. All steam engines and combustion engines are driven by these metaphysical principles of thermodynamics. So they made possible the whole combustion engine world that we've been inhabiting ever since, and whose days, of course, are numbered with peak oil and the outgassing of all of our CO2 with the creation of a greenhouse sphere now. So that's time's arrow, and I would say that time begins to come into physics there in the middle of the 19th century, not so much with Einstein. But by the time we get to Einstein, 1905 is when he publishes his paper on the electrodynamics of moving bodies, in which he says that, or what can be derived from the paper, is that what happens to a body when it approaches the speed of light is three things. One is that the body collapses into two-dimensionality. The second characteristic is that time stops and slows down the faster it goes as it approaches light speed, and it also gains infinite mass. And so it's really impossible for any body with mass to attain pure light speed except for photons, which are, after all, massless particles. But this is interesting because you can see how, with Einstein, time slows down as the third dimension collapses, as we shift back from the three-dimensional world that had been built by the perspectival world of Spengler's infinite space and Gebser's perspectival consciousness structure. With the collapse of dimensions, time also collapses as well and slows down, so that you're back actually, in an interesting way, into the mythical consciousness structure, in which, remember, the structure of the world there was two-dimensional. Time exists in a cyclical sense, but it's a two-dimensional world, and indeed, it is the case that in the realm of mythology, the figures of myth are two-dimensional figures. They're not multi-dimensional. The mythical landscape isn't a world, as Jung and Campbell thought that it was, that's more complex than the three-dimensional world. It's actually simpler, flatter, and more compressed, as McLuhan said when he said that a myth is actually a compression into iconic form of a complex series of processes that unfold gradually over space and time, over a long period of time. But in a mythic image or in a mythic narrative, all of these processes are collapsed. You can read a work of history about the Trojan War, or you can read Homer. You're getting less information in Homer, but you're getting a grander picture. It's less detailed, but it's also more iconic and more memorable. Achilles becomes a mythic figure that burns itself eidetically into the collective consciousness of the human species in a way that a mere historical account would not do. So the mythical landscape is a flatter one. When an individual puts on a mythical mask, as every individual did in Mesoamerican civilization, for instance, the individual in that civilization was no more than his icon, then you enter into a world that depersonalizes you, it flattens you out and turns you into an icon, as of course we are doing nowadays with our electronic culture. This is what I wrote my second book, Dead Celebrities, Living Icons, about, which is to say that with all this electronic culture, we are once again sending individuals at the speed of light. We're collapsing them into two-dimensional mythic icons and avatars, which simplify them, turn them into stereotypes and cliches that get recycled over and over again, and therefore create a kind of new, timeless world of platonic social forms that exists because these forms have been stereotyped. The Marilyn Monroe stereotype. Every actress in Hollywood still cast to this day, every blonde anyway, is cast in the mold set platonically by Marilyn Monroe. Same thing for the actors in Hollywood. They're either the James Dean type, a la, let's say, Robert Redford, or they're the Marlon Brando type. like Tom Cruise, let's say. So we have this universe of these flat platonic forms that is created by electronic culture, and I think this may be a dimension missed by Gebser. I don't know yet. I'll be interested to see as we go through Volume 2 whether he addresses this or not, whether he sees this. But for him, the thing about Einstein isn't that it regresses back to a mythical, although he had said that Einstein's rediscovery of a unified cosmos in the first volume does at least retrieve, if not necessarily regress back to the magical. It retrieves the magical with its unitary emphasis. But I also see it retrieving the mythical with the two-dimensional emphasis at light speed. Everything becomes flat, compressed, and iconic. So that's what